So, welcome everyone to the History of Gardens and Landscape seminar for the last seminar of this term. We are here at the Institute of Historical Relation in London, Institute of Historical Research in London. I'm Callahan Mullen, one of the conveners. I'd like just to remind you of the housekeeping elements we have to do here. If you would please mute your computers now and turn off the video, then I'll pass the baton on to Pippa Potts, another of conveners, and she's going to introduce our speaker this evening, William Callahan. Pippa?
Thank you very much. I'll try not to trip over with the baton. But I was looking forward to this evening's presentation, and I was reminded about our last session when, amongst other things, Andrew Marvell's poem Upon Appleton House was discussed. In a way, the garden he described there was a bit of a trailer for this evening, being not only a place where Thomas Fairfax turned his back on war, but also one where you could say he celebrated war with the garden's bastions and the flowers growing in regimental rows. Or rather, that's where Marvell perceived these two apparently opposing strands. So taking us further into a discussion of apparent contradictions and cohabitations in gardens and politics on a broader world scale and in more modern times, I'm really delighted to welcome William Callahan, who is Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. As you'll have seen from the flyer, his research focuses on the interplay of theory, culture, politics, and visual global politics. His most recent and award-winning book is Sensible Politics, up on the screen there, Visualizing International Relations. And in this, he reveals, amongst other things, a hands-on course on Japanese garden design, which has helped inform his ideas. So thank you so much for agreeing to share those ideas with Professor Callahan, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Pippa and Callahan and the other conveners for inviting me to speak at the IHR's History of Gardens and Landscape seminar. It's really great to talk to you, and I look forward to our discussion after my talk. So I'm going to start off by kind of talking about my general approach that I outlined in my book, Sensible Politics, and I'm going to bring up some of the concepts, the conceptual schemes that I use. Let's see. So one of the exciting trends in the study of international relations is the growing global politics. And then in my recent book, Sensible Politics, Visualizing International Relations, I argue that social theory and international relations both need to shift from seeing politics in terms of textual analysis, where, I mean, I've been doing this for years, for decades, where we turn photographs, films, and even gardens into text. We treat them like text and analyze their ideology through textual analysis and discourse analysis. So I guess my hope is that we need to shift from this discourse analysis approach to appreciate politics as a multi-sensory performance. Because images can viscerally move us in unexpected ways, the book argues that visuals need to be appreciated not just in terms of their ideological value, but also in terms of their affect work, not just in terms of what they mean, but also how they make us feel, both as individuals and as collectives. So to understand visual international relations, the book proposes two analytical strategies. The first should be familiar. It's what I call ideology, and I deal with ideology through what I call the visibility strategy that treats visuals as social constructions and deconstructs things as a social construction of the visual. The second approach is more about affect work, and I explore affect work through what I call the visuality strategy that switches things around. Rather than the social construction of the visual, we have the visual come first, that the visual constructs the international for a creative form of politics. My goal isn't actually to say that ideology is wrong and affect is right, but to think about the relation between the verbal and the visual, between meaning and feeling, between the iconic and the everyday, and between the West and the non-West. One of the other concepts that's in my title and that I'll use today is heterotopia, and here that utopian spaces are actually unreal. They're non-spaces, and he juxtaposes them with heterotopia, which he sees as hyper-real, kind of realer than real, as a hybrid place where multiple spaces are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. And Foucault is particularly fascinated by the garden as a heterotopia because he says it's, quote, the smallest parcel of the world, and then it's the totality of the world. It's a sort of happy universalizing heterotopia. So today I'd first like to look at what gardens mean ideologically, and then what they do effectively, how they move us effectively, especially how gardens can viscerally move us as individuals and as collectives. The ideology of gardens in some ways is pretty simple. In the paper and the chapter that this comes from, I look to the examples of imperial gardens of France's and of China's Qianlong Emperor. And I look at these and compare these two gardens to show how imperial gardens in both countries reflect broader ideological trends, especially kind of the new technologies, new techniques of the state's governance of society. And actually similar things are going on in Russia and in Thailand, where modernizing monarchs were likewise trying to build heterotopian gardens to show their political and cultural power, but also to control society in new ways. So I guess this isn't just sort of the West influencing the East. It's not this sort of Eurocentric narrative of the diffusion of knowledge from Europe to the rest of the world. I think it's more about parallel developments in the early modern period where all states, whether they're in Russia, Europe, Southeast Asia, or East Asia, all states were dealing with the same problems and developing the same techniques of what some of us call cultural governance. Louis XIV certainly built Versailles for pleasure, but the garden also was a way to show people both at home and abroad his new imperial regime's control over nature, but importantly, it's also showed his control over society. And the geometric forms that you can see in the slide, the geometric forms of Versailles are actually designed to knit together diverse elements into a heterotopic whole. The Qianlong Emperor in China did similar things at the Garden of Perfect Brilliance in Beijing. This is called the Old Summer Garden now, Old Summer Palace now. And what is interesting is that the Garden of Perfect Brilliance was also a laboratory of power that produced both kind of the Chinese Empire and also produced a sort of normative order, the normative Sinocentric, the normative China-centric world order. The Qianlong Emperor is interesting because he went out on military campaigns and conquered like Northwest, what is Northwest China now. He expanded the territory of China by about 50%. And then he also went on imperial tours to kind of show his sort of civilian side as well as his martial side. And it's both his martial campaigns and his civilian tours. He went and looked at gardens. He brought back ideas, and even gardeners, and even like they dug up gardens and brought them back to Beijing to be planted in the kind of northwest quadrant of Beijing. So what is interesting is that the Garden of Perfect Brilliance was constructed to be a condensed version of what Qianlong thought of the best gardens in the Chinese Empire. It also worked on a kind of imperial politics internationally because vassals from East Asia and Southeast Asia and other places, they actually came to the garden to offer tribute to the emperor. And often the tribute that they offered were garden materials, that they were exotic plants from their countries and ornamental stones that were meant for the Garden of Perfect Brilliance itself. The Qianlong Emperor also included foreign garden designs. He built a special so-called Western palaces, meaning European palaces section of the garden, where he could go there because it's life size, and he could go there and performatively act out what he thought it would be like to be a European king in a European palace, European style palace. Sadly, the Garden of Perfect Brilliance was burnt down in 1860 by the British and French armies during the Second Opium War. But actually, because of this, this kind of burning down, this trashing, this ruining of the best garden in China, the garden continues to be a site of international relations up till today, because the burned out ruins are still there, and they've been mobilized in Chinese education and Chinese historiography as evidence of Chinese civilization, but also evidence of Western barbarism. I can talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested. There are many other examples of gardens as state ideological projects, especially how since the late 19th century, both China and Japan have worked to export their gardens, primarily to North America and Europe. And they've exported them as part of what we might call a soft power strategy, that they're telling in this case, the Americans, that their countries are civilized, their countries are peaceful, and thus they're not a geopolitical threat. And certainly they should not be a target for invasion, which was a big concern for both China and Japan at this time. Interestingly, just this year, there's been a very bizarre twist on this. A few years ago, maybe about 10 years ago now, the Chinese government offered and planned to spend 100 of traditional Chinese gardens in Washington, D.C.'s National Arboretum. And people were wondering, why are they spending so much money? I mean, I guess they get some prestige or status in the National Arboretum. What happened this year is the project was canceled because the garden design turned out to be a cover for a Chinese government listening post that would spy on the US military's cyber command base, which is just like over the hill. So it's very, very bizarre how this sort of the soft power and high culture of gardens often mixes with the hard power of espionage and warfare. Anyway, I critically analyze garden ideology in much more detail in my paper. And as I said, we can talk about it during the Q&A if you're interested. What I'd like to do now is spend most of my time not on ideology, but on affect. So that the War and Peace can help us to analyze the sensible politics of two controversial examples, the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo and the Nanjing Massacre Memorial in China. Well, they're both typically understood as modern war memorial sites. Both were actually designed as gardens, and they're often experienced as gardens. Well, I hope I've shown how gardens as social constructions of the visual are sites of ideology. Now I'd like to use my own Japanese garden design experience to explore how the aesthetic conventions and practical techniques of garden building can do politics in a different way by exciting affect. The argument is that this set of garden building practices engages in a multi-sensory construction of the social that can provoke both cultural governance and resistance to it. The aim is to see how memorials not only convey facts and figures, but also to show how they use garden building conventions to produce political meaning and political effect, and not necessarily the ideologies and feelings that we've come to expect. So it's helpful to explore briefly the conventions and practical techniques of Japanese and Chinese garden building. So as you know, the classical Chinese garden manual, the Yuanye, from 1631, tells us there are no fixed rules in garden creation. It all depends on what the landscape lends. So what is interesting about garden building is that there's no orthodoxy. There's not a rule book that you can go to find out how to build a correct Chinese garden. And that's the first thing you learn when you're studying garden design, that there's no recipe or checklist. Rather, a garden is judged by how it combines, in China, it's judged by how it combines 5 elements: rocks, water, architecture, plants, and poetry. And how it combines these 5 elements according to the aesthetic conventions of irregularity, asymmetry, variety, and rusticity. Unlike French formal gardens that remake the environment, Chinese garden designers often defer to the site to take advantage of the environment's natural contours and borrowed views. Certainly, they still shape the site. According to the Yuanye, the gardening handbook, gardening is the process of, quote, digging ponds and piling up rocks for mountains, unquote. This underlines the need to construct an aesthetic balance between rocks and water, which is seen as a symbolic balance between magical mountains and sacred lakes. This aesthetic balance is not simply of natural elements, because gardens also often integrate aspects of high culture. Chinese gardens characteristically contain poetic inscriptions and architectural follies. So rather than the precise geometry of French formal gardens, Chinese and Japanese gardens thrive on the aesthetic experience of irregularity. A common feature is the zigzag bridge, which we can see here. That questions, often bridges join not just different material places, but different ideological and affective spaces, leading us from one world to another. As a Chinese master gardener named Shen Fu explains, garden building employs the heterotopic art of deception, quote, showing the large and the small. Oh, I noticed that my internet connection is unstable. Shen Fu explains, showing the large and the small and the large, providing for the real in the unreal world and for the unreal in the real, unquote. Unlike with visual images, where authenticity is a major issue, when we treat gardens as multisensory spaces, then manipulation is actually valued. It's not a problem. Manipulation is valued as a way of making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. The value of garden building is that it's a contingent multisensory construction. It's a heavily designed distribution of this, what some people would call distribution of the senses, the seeable, the hearable, the smellable, the touchable, and thus of the sayable, the thinkable, and the doable. That's kind of Jacques Ranciere's explanation for these things. Well, Chinese, actually, no, we have to go Japanese. Well, Chinese gardens employ 5 elements. Japanese gardens generally look to 3 elements, namely water, stones, and plants. But once again, the dynamic of the garden lies in the way it's designed rather than in its design elements. It values the harmonic interplay between 2-dimensional planes like ponds, rake sand, walls, and fences, and between 2-dimensional planes and 3-dimensional volumes, especially rocks and clipped plants. There's always a tension between the awe at nature's wildness and the need for human control. Gardens in both China and Japan thus don't focus on flowers and plants. They're more conceptual, as an interplay of style and content that excites affective experiences. As visual constructions of the social, and visual constructions are a multisensory construction of social order, and I would say of world order. Now we go to our first example. The Nanjing Massacre Memorial in the city of Nanjing in central China is the most popular museum in China. It gets 10 million visitors every year. It commemorates the victims of atrocities committed by the Imperial Japanese Army when it invaded the Chinese capital in 1937. It's actually an award-winning set of structures, and starting with the Memorial Hall's main exhibit. The main exhibit is actually in a kind of a tomb-like underground history museum that commemorates the victims of wartime atrocities by graphically, I mean very graphically, telling the horrific story of rape, murder, looting, and destruction. While the museum worked to nail down the meaning of the memorial as singular and dystopic of a militaristic Japan attacking a civilized China, the overall style of the memorial space is more heterotopian. It was designed by top architect Qi Kang, who felt his mission was to express the, quote, social and national feelings, unquote, of the Nanjing Massacre by, quote, embodying the historical disaster in the entire design of the environment, unquote. To do this, Qi mixed the design styles of socialist realism, classical Chinese gardens, and Japanese public architecture. His task was to generate an effective atmosphere using landscape gardening techniques to give visitors a true representation of what happened in history. In a word, buildings, grounds, walls, trees, slopes, and sculptures were essential elements not to be neglected, unquote. The memorial is heterotopian because it was actually built in 4 phases. And today I'll just talk about one of the first phases called the disaster in Jinling. Jinling is another name for Nanjing. It's a public sculpture that opened in 1997. Since Qigong tells us that its organizing themes are pain and hatred, this garden focuses sharply on what is seen as China's unfinished historical business with Japan. This monumental sculpture, it's the one on the left, this monumental sculpture shows a scene of violence and tragedy where Chinese people suffered during Japan's invasion of Nanjing, which resulted in a huge death toll and the destruction of 1/3 of the city's buildings. The site includes a massive decapitated man's screaming head, that's the thing here, center right, frantically outstretched arm of a buried alive victim, that's this thing over here on the central left. And then on the right-hand side, a city wall that has been mutilated by artillery fire. You can't see it, but there's like pockmarks in it showing artillery fire. Xi's aim here is for the memorial sculpture to be, quote, resonant with the wails and shrieks of the dead, unquote. But on second glance, the disaster in Jinling also employs many classical Chinese garden building conventions. As Xi explains, quote, in design, Chinese gardens came to mind, which is a sort of concentration of nature with mountains and pavilions put in a limited ensemble, unquote. When viewed from this kind of oblique angle of it as a classical, the memorial has, and I'm comparing it with just a Japanese garden on the right, which has lots of the same elements as this Chinese garden. The memorial has the familiar mix of water, rocks, and architecture, and there is a harmonic dynamic between the water-like gravel in the front and the mountain-like wall in the rear. The sculptures of a dismembered head and clawing arm in a way resemble a classical Chinese garden's ornamental stones. The bullet-ridden city wall inscribed with the official number of victims, 300,000 dead, is much like the garden's symbolic mountain range inscribed with classical poetry. Lastly, the curved bridge that takes visitors over a river of gravel to a different effective space that has vibrant pine trees that evoke virtue and eternal life. Hence, I think that the disaster in Jinling segment of the Nanjing Massacre Memorial, it's not simply a memorial, it's a Chinese garden that visually excites feelings of anger, loss, and remembrance in a particular effective way. Now I'll move on to the second example of the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, downtown Tokyo. Like, it's a national war memorial, and like most national war memorials, the Yasukuni Shrine commemorates the sacrifice of people who died for their country. All fallen soldiers' souls are interned in this Shinto shrine that is sponsored by the Japanese emperor. But it's also a very controversial place because in 1978, some of the Shinto people at the shrine secretly added the souls of thousands of war criminals from World War II. So there's a controversy arises whenever Japanese politicians visit the shrine to honor their country's fallen warriors, because now they're hold on a second. Because now they're honoring war criminals, which is, understandably and justifiably seen as a horrible thing to do. China and South Korea are particularly critical of such actions, of these visits to the Yasukuni Shrine by leaders, because they're still mourning the atrocities committed by Imperial Japan in World War II and in the Korean case since the early 20th century. When Japanese leaders go to the Yasukuni Shrine, it stokes up fear in East Asia of a return of Japanese militarism. And if we take seriously the message of the Yushukan Museum, which is the museum, kind of the official museum of the Yasukuni Shrine, and it's on the same grounds as the shrine, I think there is something to worry about. Because the Yushukan Museum is really like a right-wing fascist museum. It glorifies Japan, both as a heroic warrior nation, but also as a victim. As kind of the victimology comes out very strongly there. So this is the main way people understand the Yasukuni Shrine. What I'm doing, not surprisingly, is thinking of different ways of understanding it. And if we think of the Yasukuni Shrine as a garden park, then it has a much more ambiguous meaning. And that the Yasukuni Shrine actually was designed as a garden and it's often experienced as a garden. Unlike the Nanjing Massacre Memorial, which is mostly contained behind high walls, the Yasukuni Shrine is actually at a crossroads of pedestrian traffic at the heart of the city of Tokyo. To put it another way, there's more than one route through the shrine, and there's more than one way to experience the shrine. People crisscross it as part of their everyday activities, creating different meanings as they walk it. Certainly, it's a sacred space, and it's certainly a hyper-nationalist site, but it's also a shortcut that people take. It's a place where people go to smoke, to eat your lunch on a sunny day. I found a fascinating YouTube video called Walking in Tokyo, Yasukuni Shrine. What's interesting about it is that it records the experience of going to the shrine simply by walking through the shrine and thus performing this Japanese stroll garden via an impious itinerary. The video was actually a response to a film made of the hyper-nationalist crowds that gathered in 2006 to cheer on Prime Minister Koizumi's controversial visit to the shrine on the anniversary of the end of World War II on August 15th of that year. The video shows how the Yasukuni Shrine has meanings beyond this hyper-nationalism and militarism, I think. Importantly, the video does this without any narration. It lets the images and sounds of partisan contestation in everyday life do the political work. Video starts off outside the shrine grounds in the midst of a political demonstration, complete with banners, activists with loudspeakers, and police helicopters circulating overhead. It offers the perspective of an ordinary visitor walking in the front gate of the shrine and up the main pedestrianized avenue of the Yasukuni Shrine, in a way performing the shrine as a Edo or Tokyo stroll garden. It's fascinating to see and actually to hear the multi-sensory experience evolve from partisan politics kind of at the gates of the garden to the politics of everyday life within the garden. People walking the site shift from activists outside the gate to a human assemblage on the shrine grounds of salarymen, students, families, tourists, and shoppers all out for a stroll. Surely some people are going to the Yasukuni Museum, the right-wing museum I mentioned. That's actually not the focus of this film. Others pause to experience the sacred space, while yet another set of people traverse the site as a crossroads between here and there. In this way, meaning is actively constructed in the perambulative performances worthy of Desserteau's practice of everyday life. Rather than follow the militarist Yasukuni Museum to determine the ideology of the experience, I think we can look at the sacred pond garden at the back of the shrine to reframe our understanding of it as a site of life reflection and other possibilities. I was giving a similar presentation in one of my undergraduate classes, which is on visual international politics. And one of my students, who I'm very good friends with, I saw him just like last Monday, he came to my class and kind of looked at the films that we were screening last Monday. But he was outraged at my analysis, that this is outrageous, Callahan, what the hell are you doing? He criticized my analysis for normalizing Japanese militarism, which is not a strange thing to do. I think that most people would be very kind of suspicious or outraged at my analysis. And he, Min, went on to say that instead of walking the shrine in impious ways, Min stated that, quote, as a Korean, it's my duty to burn down the Yasukuni Shrine, unquote. And you'd be surprised because he's a very lovely and nonviolent person, but he was just so angry at this interpretation. But I think that to resist cultural governance, I would argue that it's not necessary to burn down China's imperial garden as the Anglo-French forces did in 1860, or to torch the Yasukuni Shrine now, as my friend Min suggested. I think that people can resist state-led cultural governance simply by experiencing the garden as a heterotopia in performances that not only count of international relations. In this way, the garden experience moves from ideology to effect. This is a poem by the Meiji Emperor, who was in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So conclusion, this paper has explored the multisensory workings of key gardens to make two main points. First, the ideological argument that says that gardens are unexpected spaces for international politics of social ordering and world ordering, which in turn impact issues of diplomacy, war, and peace. The second is the affective politics argument, which says that to understand the sensible politics of gardens, it's necessary to take an aesthetic approach to IR that appreciates gardens as multisensory performances of cultural governance and resistance, where gardens are infrastructures of feeling that provoke unexpected, effective communities of sense. So I admit that this is kind of a strange way of looking at these gardens and looking at these national war memorials as gardens. It's what said such oblique interventions underline how war memorials and gardens are actually not stable containers of ideology. They don't have just one meaning. So we have to actively interpret and reinterpret them as multisensory performances of cultural governance and resistance. I've been talking primarily about East Asian international politics because that's my particular area of interest and expertise. What I really hope is that my research will generate further studies of the international politics of gardens that explore examples from other times and places. So for example, what sense can we make of the National September, which embodies what kind of ideology and affect is going on there? I think that on the one hand, its official museum seems to follow the ideological strategy that we saw in the Nanjing Massacre Memorial. Both the 9/11 Memorial and the Nanjing Massacre Memorial provoke raw emotions, not just from what they show, but from where they are, you know, that they, through their intimate connection with death. The Nanjing Massacre Memorial is actually built on the site of a mass grave. And the 9/11 Memorial, thousands of people met a violent death in New York. Both underground museums seek to stabilize the meaning of the tragedy. Everything okay? Both underground museums seek to stabilize. Stabilize the meaning of the tragedy and the identity of the nation by assigning the roles of villains and victims in a tragically heroic narrative. But on the other hand, rather than be walled off like the Nanjing Massacre Memorial, the above ground 9/11 Memorial is open, like the Yasukuni Shrine. The 9/11 Memorial is at a key hub in New York's mass transportation system. So it's at even more of a crossroads than the Yasukuni Shrine. And even more people are traversing it, going from here to there in everyday life, as well as going there specifically as a pilgrimage to the memorial. And Michael Arad's Reflecting Absence Memorial, which you can see in the picture, is really fascinating because it's radically open. Its twin voids reproduce the gaping wound in the cityscape as a pair of black holes. As in the Japanese stroll garden, this water garden is open to multiple interpretations as a site of legend suggests. The 9/11 Memorial is ripe for further analysis. And I think it can be profitably analyzed as a garden heterotopia that excites performances of cultural governance and resistance. It highlights how, as infrastructures of feeling, memorials and gardens are not simply visual experiences, but are entangled performances that provoke multisensory affective experiences. Here to me, garden building is theory building. By producing new sights and sensibilities, gardens creatively shape our understanding of international relations. Okay, thank you.